Well, Neil, first of all, I got to say, I recommended many of these
reserve list cards
on January 11th or before. I've got the report in my hand that I sent out to my subscribers, and here's the list. The shorts, first of all of this nonsense, all of this noise, all of this whining by
Reddit,
it's making me sick. 140% of
Mishra's workshop
was short. I didn't hear one person on TV complaining about
Reddit
trying to crush
Mishra's workshop.
140% short. I told my subscribers, buy this
card,
and they made a fortune. I also told them to buy
Gilded Drake.
We took profits on that today.
Memory Jar.
That's up huge.
Raging River.
That's up huge. Neil, you can't allow
Reddit
to short 75% of a
card.
And nobody says anything. Crush these
cards
into the dirt, and then when the individual
player
makes money, everyone's up in arms. Oh, they're going to lose their shirt. Don't you think people are trading? If it traded 80 billion
cards
today, people are ringing the register. I have a kid who bought a
Lotus.
He made $50,000 and bought
a Lotus.
So yeah, some people are going to lose and some are going to win. But if they want to change the rules of the game now because the general public is making money after decades of the shorts crushing thousands of
cards
into the dirt. I have watched
cards
being crushed completely to zero, and no one ever whispered anything because those
cards
didn't have Wall Street sponsorship. They were small names. Maybe they went public through a reverse takeover. Whatever it was, the shorts have had their way with the market for decades. No one's ever complained about it. So I am thrilled. If you were going to try to destroy
card game
by shorting 140% of its
cards,
you have to accept the fact that individual
players
are playing the same game that you're playing and now you're losing.
You are listening to Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I'm your host, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, too quiet to be heard in the shower, Maddox. We got a little bit of feedback, Anthony. Got a little bit of feedback on the show. Usually the feedback we get is, oh, could you talk about this kind of idea or archetype, or, get questions about cube, or people send us their cube lists. But this is the first time we heard somebody that basically requested that you speak a little bit louder so that they can hear you. And, I pushed up back on this a little bit because I produced this show. I take pride in it. And you are in real life a bit quieter than me, but we have the power of microphones and computer technology. So I turn your track up a little bit whenever I produce the show to try and balance it out. But somebody reported basically that, when they listen to the podcast in the shower, your voice sometimes gets drowned out by the water. So
To say I'm a little bit quieter than you is a huge understatement. You are definitely on the loud end of the spectrum. I'm definitely on the quiet end of the spectrum. I thought I was just going to be Anthony, not Andy. Anthony that can't be heard in the shower. That's feedback I've never gotten before in any context.
Yeah, well, you gotta get... I was a little bit surprised to hear people are listening in the shower. Have you ever listened to a podcast in the shower, Anthony?
I've tried. I've definitely tried.
I actually haven't tried, which is weird because I've tried listening to podcasts in basically every aspect of life, but the shower has never come up for me.
It's a great idea, but I found all podcasts to be too quiet, especially, I don't have speakers in the shower. I'm just on my phone, so maybe I'll try again. I'll find some loud podcasts. If anyone has recommendations for good, loud podcasts to listen to in the shower, I'm open to them.
Nice and loud. Voices that cut through the steam.
Voices that do not have the same timbre as a shower.
Yeah, maybe you just have this beautiful, voice that just basically sounds like falling water.
It's a great spin.
How many people do you think are in the shower right now listening to us talk about Magic cards?
2.
That right now is going to echo to infinity because people can play this podcast whenever they want. That's the beauty of podcasts. It's great. Anyway, if you're listening to the podcast in a weird situation or place, I want to hear from you. Just send us an email to mail@luckypaper.co and tell us the weirdest place you've ever listened to Anthony and I talk about Magic cards.
Record a voice memo in the shower and let us know.
Yeah, you can record a voice memo. We'll put it in the show. That'll also be fun. Which actually brings up an idea, Anthony. I wanted to make a request of our listeners. We've opened up before and said that we're happy to receive voice memos of questions or things so we can include them in the show. And next week we're going to be recording our call time review. The set perspective is up now, and it's been up for a week. I feel like most of you have probably filled it out, and thank you. If you have not yet filled it out, you want to be cool and in the Cool Kids Club, so you got to go to luckypaper.co/survey/KHM and tell us what cards you are testing in your cube or cubes from Kaldheim. But Anthony, I think it would be great if people would send us voice memos of their hottest, spiciest takes on cards in Kaldheim. And if you do this, I'll pepper them in the episode, basically, whenever we're talking about a specific card. In our discussion coming up, we're going to have Jet back on the show, who is the contributor to Lucky Paper that organizes all of our perspectives. And, when we're talking about a card, I'll throw in some voice memos of listeners. I think that'd be really cool if we can get some of those. I'm
also open to totally reasonable regular takes.
Yeah, you could do that, I guess. It's not as quite a compelling call to action, Send us your very reasoned, well thought out, uncontroversial takes.
That's what I enjoy. I mean, we added this open sort of like comments field to the survey, which for this particular round, which has been just great to see people provide a little bit of extra context. Like, hey, there's this class of cards that I think are powerful, but they don't fit in my environment for a certain reason, or they have this logistical problem. And that little bit of extra color has been really fun to see the surveys come in.
I agree. It has made it even more exciting to watch the surveys roll in. And so if you filled out the survey, you have an opportunity to fill out a comment field and tell us why you're testing Usher of the Fallen, as everyone is.
Oh my god, it's ridiculous.
Little spoiler alert for the results of the survey, which will be out before our next show. But that card is well-liked, it seems, by people that own cubes. Anthony, this week we're going to do something a little bit different. We always do, some kind of general thrust of a topic on the show, but rarely very structured. But this week, Anthony, we had an idea for a little mini show that was just basically kind of a history of our personal cube level ups. Which this is some language we're cribbing from our arch rivals' limited resources. Though, are they the first ones to refer to an aspect of playing Magic as a level up, you think?
I think that applies to all kinds of different fields, Magic and beyond, and I don't believe it started there.
Oh, I've never heard it applied to anything else. I've never heard of somebody be like, here's my cooking level up, or my, lawn care level up. All right, well, maybe we're not cribbing it from them. Maybe it's just a broader idea. But yeah, we're going to go through. Anthony and I have, as regular listeners will know, very different cubes and somewhat different approaches to cube design. And so we're going to talk about the moments that we maybe had this revelation and changed course a little bit in how our cubes were designed and curated, or how we thought about how our cubes were designed and curated, which is not meant to be a comprehensive list of all the most important things you should know if you're designing a cube, but is more meant to be just the things that happen to resonate with us. And, honestly, it's kind of a list of things that we missed at first, right? That when we were first designing cubes, we overlooked. So maybe that'll be something that can help inspire people that are listening. Because this is kind of a meaty topic, we are not going to do a listener-submitted Pack 1 Pick 1 this week, but we are going to continue to do this in the future. So if you want to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, send us a link to your cube and mail at luckypaper.co, along with your voice memo of your very reasonable, uncontroversial takes from Kaldheim, and we will do it on the show sometime. All right, Anthony, do you want to go first, or do you want to close off? I know we both have four level ups we've identified. Do you want to open or close?
I can take a swing at it.
All right. Lead off,
I feel like some of mine are so vanilla, so basic, that maybe I need to get in there first before you try and take them out from under me.
I have not given you my list. You kind of jumped your list in the chat before I could say, don't spoil it. So I can tell you there is no overlap, so don't worry about that.
Okay, great. So my first one is a really easy lowball. If you've ever been in a conversation with people about cubes, I feel like this is always the first thing you hear, and was something that I learned pretty quickly. Or not that I learned, but it became intuitive to me. I saw it play out in reality when I built my first cube, which is just that you can play a lot more lands, meaning specifically fixing lands, than you think you can. Have you also found this to be the case?
Yeah, the number of lands in my cube has only gone up. It has never gone down, yeah. And it kind of goes up slowly year over year, and it's just kind of creeping up there. And recently I've actually considered upping my cube to 384 over 360 and making the pack 16 cards and just adding only more lands, basically.
Yeah, I've honestly thought of doing almost exactly the same thing. And what it comes down to is that, especially if you're like us and coming from the background of playing mostly limited, you're used to just there not being a lot of lands and the gameplay working out pretty much fine. But the difference in almost every cube environment is that you're playing these much more streamlined sets of cards. Pretty much every card is playable to some degree, and that also means that the power level is going to be a little bit higher. And all that comes together to both mean you can afford to spend more of your picks taking lands because you're not worried about ending up with too many unplayable or, just the worst cards in your deck. And at the same time, it's more costly to not have those lands because as the power level increases, you're punished more for not having the right lands at the right time. So all of that works together to just say you can play more lands, and you can play even a lot more than you think. Because out of a 45 card pool, if you're doing a standard kind of draft style, making a bunch of those lands ends up just playing really well.
Just to give a kind of a baseline, if we use entirely relative terms, I don't know what people are imagining when you say more lands and, a normal number of lands, but I occasionally will fiddle around with a new cube list of some theme or novel idea, usually at 360 cards. And now, whenever I do that, if I make a new cube of 360 cards, as a baseline, I will put in at least 6 cycles of fixing lands. Usually I'll just drop in 4 cycles of shocks and 2 cycles of fetches, and just that's a baseline, assuming that, the environment wants shocks and fetches. That's like bare minimum, and then I will go up from there depending on what the cube specifically wants or needs. 60 is kind of like my like starting point now.
Wow, that's even a lot more lands.
It turns out you can do a lot of lands.
Guess what? My next level up is I can play even more lands.
Yeah, this is a deep topic to kind of go into all the details of it, and maybe we can do that more on a future episode. I have a draft article in the making about just how many lands you really can play in a cube and what the diminishing returns are. But to kind of summarize, I agree with you completely, and I think people listening might be saying to themselves, what about the boogeyman of 4 or 5 color good stuff decks? I don't want my players to just be able to play every single card. And, you, Anthony, you're a staunch defender of the color pie. I know you don't want your drafters to be able to play every single card they draft and ignore the colors completely. I mean,
more than that, I don't think that's a color pie issue. That just means that when you can play every color in every deck, you end up just getting the situation where players can just basically take the best card out of every pack, and it just leads to worse gameplay where you're not drafting interesting synergies or like complex tensions. It's just 5 color good stuff.
But that is a color pie. That's why the color pie was invented, so that you couldn't just put all the best cards in your deck, and you had to make some decisions.
You're right.
And some
so
trade-offs.
like maintaining not the aesthetic of the color pie, but
right.
the tension, the productive tension that it adds. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, the spirit of the color pie, not specifically that white can't have card draw and green can't have flyers or whatever, but just the
green
spirit
shouldn't
of
have
it.
like 4 Death Touch flyers for 6 mana or whatever.
Oh, we love you, Hornet Queen. I think it's a great level up. I think the 4 to 5 color good stuff concern is really overstated. And more importantly, I think it's worth pointing out that certainly I think the fixing in your cube does contribute to whether or not a true 4 or 5 color, ignore all signposts and just draft whatever cards you want deck is viable. But much more important, I think, in that recipe is what are the payoffs for that deck? What are the really good cards that deck gets to play, and do they actually work together, right? I have one of the cubes I've been fiddling around with is this tribal cube that has a lot of gold cards in it, a lot of fixing, and it's kind of a slower environment where there isn't a super fast aggro deck, there is no dedicated control deck, there's no board wipes. It's really all about kind of interactions on the board. And with those descriptors, you might expect it to be the environment where just taking all the gold cards and, all the fixing and kind of ignoring everything and just playing the best cards would work. But because it's a tribal cube, a lot of those gold cards just do not go together at all. They're incompatible with each other. You can't play the Golgari 4-drop next to the Boros 5-drop. They have no interactions. They might even be a nombo with each other. And so that idea of just taking all the good cards is naturally dissuaded by the structure of the cube. So thinking about the payoffs for being in the 4 and 5 color deck and not just the enablers in the form of the fixing, I think is as important, if not more important, when making sure that deck doesn't actually become a thing.
Yeah, it's funny to me that you mentioned that being a concern, because I've actually almost experienced the opposite. I definitely early in my cube had the issue of the 5 color good stuff being predatory and consuming some of the kinds of gameplay I wanted. But I also saw that actually what I needed was even more fixing in the aggressive colors and faster fixing in the aggressive colors, because another of these interlocking pieces that really controls that kind of deck building is the overall speed of the format.
Right. Yeah, overall, I think more fixing just helps all the decks. And if one of your speeds of decks or one of your archetypes is dominant, adding or removing fixing is not really going to have a huge effect on it. The one big exception being specifically monocolored archetypes, right? If you have cube that is meant to be drafted in some combinations of monocolors. Like, my cube does support mono white. The mono white deck doesn't get any better or any worse as you add more fixing, where all the other decks do get a little better when you add fixing. So that's a thing to be aware of. But in general, I think fixing used by pretty much every deck and affects them pretty similarly, right? Like, more fixing is just going to make all the decks better, which I think is a direction most people want their cubes to go.
The pushback that I've heard more often is that people just say drafting lands is boring. And I think the counter to that is just that if drafting lands is boring, don't do it. Like, put them in there and make it available for the players that do want to draft lands. And that doesn't really punish anybody.
Boring is very subjective. It's hard to weigh in on that at all from a design perspective, because if you don't like it, you don't like it. I mean, that's just...
Well, I mean more just if you have players in your group that do enjoy drafting lands and some that don't, that's fine. They open up a pack. They're not forced to take the lands. There's still going to be plenty for them to take.
All right, Anthony, that's a good first level up. More
All right, let's do a whole episode on, well, I want to say on lands, but probably on every single one of these things in the future.
Yeah, this episode, I think, if we can maybe plan to do this episode in a month or so, I will definitely be motivated to finish my dumb article, and that can maybe be the sort of seed crystal for that episode. Good thing to get me motivated.
All right, what's your first level up?
So my level ups, I don't know if you did this too, Anthony. I put my level ups kind of roughly in chronological order of like when they occurred in my history as a cube designer. And the first level up, the first time I can remember thinking about my cube very differently, was very early on in my time owning it. And for me, I'm just going to say my first level up is supporting aggro. And I don't love that phrasing of supporting aggro, because we've talked on the show before about how whatever deck is the fastest is the aggro deck, and I don't want to pretend like supporting aggro means you have to run a bunch of Jackal Pups or whatever, or Savannah Lions. But for my cube, I originally got into cube by watching LSV draft the Magic Online cube on YouTube and on, Twitch. That's how I learned what cube was. That's how I got excited about the possibility of making a cube. And, I've probably watched, 100 plus drafts he's done on his YouTube channel. And I can probably count on one hand the number of times that LSV has drafted what I would call an aggro deck. Maybe like 3 times. It's just really not what he's interested in doing. It's not what he wants to do for his stream, which is, of course, different than playing at a competitive level event. Like, he's just not interested in drafting aggro and will very, very rarely do it. So because of that, because my sort of frame of reference was LSV's draft decks, and he would obviously play against all of the other players in the actual matches, and he'd come up against aggro decks. So it's not like I wasn't aware that aggro could be a thing. But because my frame of reference was so contextualized by watching him play, my first version of my cube, had a lot of some of the... I think I had Isamaru in the very first version of my cube, because I was like, a 1-mana 2/2, that's broken. That's a great card. And I had a couple other aggro cards, traditional aggro cards, but really nowhere near the density that needed to be supported, because I wanted people to be able to play the sweet decks that LSV would get excited about when he was playing, and other streamers that I got turned on to after watching LSV's videos got real excited about playing. These greedy decks, these combo decks, these, things that get to combine these things in fun ways. And oftentimes people will kind of contextualize and call aggro the fun police, which I don't think is particularly fair, but people say that. So my first level up was really realizing that I needed to put a lot more cheap threats in the colors that I wanted aggro to be viable in, but more importantly, that supporting aggro was not opposed to the idea of drafting sweet decks. In fact, I would argue that the presence of 2 or more aggro decks in the average pod of 8 players actually makes the sweet decks that much more sweet. What makes a sweet deck sweet is that they are able to thrive under pressure, right? That the pressure is what makes them sweet. If they were just playing solitary, and you 2 sweet decks up against one another with very little interaction, they're just doing their big thing, that's not actually cool. It's not fun to do it when your opponent's not, threatening you at all. And so I don't think a particular alliance with a given type of speed of deck, but I find myself in limited, oftentimes being drawn to the aggro decks. I think oftentimes because other players don't like to play them. I've come to really love aggro. It's a really critical part of my cube, I think, and a huge part of all the other decisions I've made in my environment. And it kind of came from that realization that it's not that including aggro means that there are no sweet decks, right? And again, sweet is kind of subjective, but I think you get what I'm getting at. It's really actually pretty fun and great to be able to put a deck together of a bunch of dinky little, 1-mana creatures that would not be good in retail limited in most environments, or, have never seen play in any constructed format ever, and, combine them into a potent deck that abuses tempo and can beat a deck full of some of the most powerful banned cards, in the history of Magic's time. So that's my first level up is aggro.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely experienced the exact same thing. And like you said, it's not a matter of saying, like, well, aggro is fun, so it is one of the options I should make available. It's more that the fastest deck in the format really shapes the format and allows everything else to thrive or just sort of make sense at all, have a context for it. And yeah, the way that I've gone about implementing that in my cube, which is much lower power, and I actually want to support multicolor aggressive decks, is a little bit different, but the sort of core lesson of there has to be a fastest deck that really puts pressure on other decks to shape things. And even more what you said is there has to be more than one. Like, if it's just, I'm going to draft this one aggro deck and it's only going to look one way, that really is kind of like the extreme of parasitism and isn't very exciting. So having multiple different options, I think, is really critical as well.
And we've talked about before how if you were able to design some environment, even with, let's say, theoretically, a non-parasitic aggro deck, but there was still only room enough for one in a pot of 8, I don't think that density means that every other player at the table has to think about what they're going to do against the aggro deck.
Right,
if there's only one at the table, like, the chances you're going to play them are like slightly less than half, and you just are probably you're probably going to increase your overall win percentage by primarily picking cards to combat the other 6 decks at the table and not the one aggro deck if it's not you. The way you put it is really good, because I'm not saying aggro in terms of like a white 1-drop aggro, even though that is the flavor of aggro I do support in my primary cube. Maybe the best way to put it is consciously having a plan for the fastest deck in your cube, not just letting it evolve and become whatever based on all the other things you're playing. Like, think about what you want your fastest deck to be.
You as the designer having a plan for what players' plans can be.
Exactly, yeah. Like, I love having emergent things in my cubes. I don't want to sort of think through every possible iteration of deck. I like that people can do unexpected things and combine things in weird ways. I think it's one of the great joys of cube. But I think this specific sort of corner where we're talking about the sort of fastest, most proactive, most threatening deck, whatever that looks like in your environment, I think putting a lot of thought into that and giving some consideration to how can this deck be drafted reliably? What is this player's strategy? How does this player not immediately lose to a board wipe or a 4/4 or whatever? Like, giving that deck enough tools that you've really thought about it, I think sets a really good foundation for the rest of the environment. Because like you said, those decks in a lot of ways kind of define the speed of all the games of all of the other decks, right? Like, if your mid-range deck is built to be aware of the aggro deck and your control decks are built to beat that aggro deck, then even when they're playing each other, when it's mid-range versus control matchup, they were both built in the context of, we're going to come up against this aggro deck eventually, and so that informed all the sort of choices that went into it. So,
and that even makes sideboarding more fun. Like, you have to draft a deck that can be flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's reword this to consciously designing the fastest, most proactive decks in your cube and thinking about what their game plan is and making sure it's reliably successful. What's the word? Like, just make sure it's consistent. Viable. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Make sure it is viable on a regular basis. That's not as snappy as supporting aggro, but it's, I think, more accurate.
Do you edit out all the times I correct you?
Absolutely not. Sometimes I'll edit out a whole section. Like, if it's boring, then I'll edit it out. But I'll keep that one in for you, Anthony.
Nice.
All right. What's your second level up?
All right. This is another easy, quick one. So early in my cube, I love gold cards. I don't think you love gold cards quite as much as me, but I really do enjoy them. And one of the things I realized I could do early on in my cube design was I could add a lot of hybrid cards in order to actually balance some of those out. And my logic is that hybrid cards are actually kind of the opposite of gold cards. Whereas a gold card takes 2 separate colors of mana, it really puts you into a narrow lane in terms of the kind of decks it can fit in. A hybrid card is even more flexible, so even though you look at it, it looks similar to a gold card, it's the opposite because it can actually fit into multiple different decks, multiple different color combinations. So I always, basically in any cube design, if I'm trying to get a lot of gold cards in there, I will also try and double down on hybrid cards as much as I can because they balance that out a little bit so you don't...
So like an antimatter, thing to your gold cards. You want to like have these things in balance so that you're not going so deep down the gold route.
Right, because the risk is at the end of the draft you end up saying like, well, my last 4 picks are all gold cards and I just can't really play them. Having those more flexible cards means that you end up having a more similar number of playables for every color combination. Hybrid
cards are great. I love them as a cube designer and a player. I I have heard Mark Rosebauer talk about them and understand them to have very narrow design space. They're very hard to actually make gold cards because of the weird, very focused limitations, but that are wider than the sort of regular limitations of the colors. But yeah, I mean, I love them. I think they're great. I'll take any card that can be cast in lots of different decks and is viable in lots of different situations, which is why, as you kind of intimated, I'm a little bit lower on actual gold cards than you are, because they do end up being pretty narrow in a lot of situations.
For sure.
I've been having fun with a couple of these lower powered cubes I've been fiddling with, Anthony, like finding removal and stuff that fits with the power level of the cubes I'm working on, which is something you've done for your cube, but my main cubes are power optimized. My cube is kind of a power optimized fair environment. The degenerate micro cube is a power optimized unfair environment. And so there I'm just playing the best spells I can get my hands on. I've never really had the joy of sorting through all of the 2 mana. Is there a word for the canonical 2 mana deal 3 only to a creature spell? That not a lightning strike, but can only kill a creature.
We'll just call it a bad lightning strike.
Sure. But there's so many of them, right? There's so many 2 mana red spells that do 3-ish damage to a creature and then have some other weird upside. Your Jaya's Greetings, your Fire Prophecies, your Abrades, all these cards. And it's just really fun to kind of sort through them. And I came across a card I'm not sure I've ever seen before and never really processed, but have you ever seen Curse of Chains?
It sounds familiar, but I can't recall it.
It's kind of a hybrid pacifism. So it's 1 and then white or a blue. So it's a hybrid blue-white card.
Oh, right, yeah.
And it's an aura, and then it just basically taps the enchanted creature at the beginning of each upkeep, which is probably pound for pound a tiny bit worse than pacifism, but for the exchange, you get to play it in a mono blue deck or a blue green deck or whatever. Right. And I think it's a very cool spell that kind of fits with the power level of roughly the removal in your cube that I really liked when I came across it.
Yeah. I mean, the other sort of adjacent point to what you're saying is that these hybrid cards don't necessarily exist at the higher power levels, so this doesn't necessarily apply to most people. And I also would say, obviously, like we were talking about with the color pie, the fact that the colors do different things is important to me. I think it adds so much to the game. It really defines the whole game, that I wouldn't just want everything to be hybrid. But with the number of hybrid cards that there are currently, we're nowhere near a point where I'm weeding them out on the basis of that.
Yeah, I would love some more playable hybrid cards at any of the power levels of any of my cubes, because I do really like them as this nice midpoint between let's talk about removal. You have removal in each color, or interaction in each color that can interact with permanents on the board, and it's functions in a certain way and it's costed in a certain way. And then on the other extreme end of the spectrum, you have colorless interaction with the board, which colorless can at some cost do almost anything that any of the colors can do, but it's always way less efficient. And then I guess actually at the other end, you have gold cards, which can sometimes even more efficiently than sort of monocolors do these interactions and have these effects. And there's this kind of big space for hybrid cards in between, right? Like cards that can fit in multiple colors that are more flexible than a monocolored card, but not as completely inefficient as most colorless cards are. And that's a big space that I would love to see more cards to fill at my power levels.
One day we'll get there.
My second level up is my biggest one. Then I promise my last 2 ones are going to be much quicker. But my second one I'm calling good decks, not good cards. And this is kind of a catch-all for really how I've evolved to thinking about the process of designing a cube, where I think a lot of people that are maybe new to cube design or have only played cubes on Magic Online or Arena or whatever, they really think of it as like it's a collection of really powerful cards, and then you draft them. And because it's all powerful cards, you obviously get powerful decks, because powerful cards lead to powerful decks. And when you're designing a cube, at least when I was, my first cube was kind of a process of picking out the most powerful cards that I wanted to play and putting them together, and you see how they interact with each other, and you have to think about your curve and stuff. You still have to have a little consideration to the meta level, but really it was let's put all these good cards together and let's make a cube, and that's what my goal is. And there's a bunch of categories of cards that I think are easy to overlook or underrate by that approach, because those cards in a vacuum or in isolation are not individually that powerful. But they oftentimes contribute to a deck whose overall strategy can be much more powerful for their inclusion. Aggro is actually one of these kinds of decks. Supporting the kind of aggro deck I support, where you're playing Jackal Pups and Savannah Lions or whatever, Savannah Lion is an awful, it's not a very powerful Magic card in a vacuum, right? Like we said, you can't play a Savannah Lion in your average limited format. Usher of the Fallen, which we mentioned before, is a card that tons of people are jamming in their cubes very excitedly, but it's probably going to be fine, like a C, in retail limited. It's going to be whatever. It's not going to be an all-star. These cards are not individually that good, but when you make them part of a bigger strategy that has a plan, they contribute to this strategy that can make a very, very, very powerful deck. Similar cards are cantrips. Cantrips are cards that, in isolation are not super exciting. They just replace themselves. It can feel like you're just taxing your draw step, but for a lot of reasons related to tempo and related to, cutting down on lands and hand smoothing and, just making sure you always have something to do with your mana, cantrips end up being really, really good in these environments. And the two that are most important, though, I think for me are scalable cards and the kind of superset of scalable cards, which is modal cards. So any card that has lots of different ways it can be used, but kind of naturally, if you have a card that can be used in 3 different ways, then it's going to be worse at any of those 3 jobs than a card that is designed to just do that job efficiently, because it can do all of them, so it has to cost more and be less efficient or whatever. And so you might look at it and you might say, like, well, why would I ever want Supreme Will, right? This is the 3 mana Leak or Impulse, right? So you're like, this is worse than Impulse, it's worse than Mana Leak. Why would I ever want this card? It's worse than all these other individual cards that I could run. You could run 50 counterspells and cantrips that are all, in each mode, better than Supreme Will. But the reason you want a card like Supreme Will is because it gives you that flexibility, so in-game, you can decide what you need at that moment, and that flexibility is worth the extra cost. I talk about this idea quite a bit in my article from last year about scalable cards, which I'll link in the show notes, but this kind of big idea of thinking about the specific role that the cards play in the decks that I want, thinking about the densities of effects that I want, making sure that, for example, like, I have a lot of counterspells or cantrips that I run that if you were to just kind of attempt to, and this is something you can't even really do, but if you were to attempt to try and how close is this to the best counterspell ever printed compared to some blue 4-drop, and then how close is this blue 4-drop to the best blue 4-drop ever printed? And I'm running probably the 20th best counterspell ever printed, and I don't even have the second best blue 4-drop, right? I think I have 1 blue 4-drop right now, so I'm just, that class of cards I just don't care about as much as this other class of cards for what I want my decks to be doing. That's kind of convoluted, but the way I summarize it, which is a kind of piece of advice I give to cube designers a lot, is think about making an environment where people can draft good decks and don't get hung up on putting a bunch of good cards in your environment, because good cards in isolation do not necessarily mean good decks.
I mean, this is a very multifaceted, singular level up. It kind of sounds like you're actually saying 2 different things. Not that that's...
Roast me.
Not that
Roast
that goes
me, Daddy.
against the core of what you're saying. But I think the first half of what you're saying is just that, if I'm going to be really reductive, it's just that synergy is important. You want your cards to be better than in a vacuum. You want your draft picks to change as you're drafting your deck, right?
I agree, though I'm a little conscious of using the word synergy because I think a lot of people have hang-ups around the word synergy and think that it means on the card synergy, where I have a card that says
sort of
sacrifice a creature, and I have a card that says when a creature dies, and that's what synergy is. And what you're talking about, what I agree with, is that it's actually synergy in the sense that if my deck has cheap removal, board wipes, and 5-mana planeswalkers, that's a kind of synergy, because all of those cards contribute to a strategy, which is a control strategy, and allow you to win games in a variety of different ways. Yes, as long as we're defining synergy that way, I agree completely. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
And then the second half of what you were saying, again, I think it does fit under the umbrella that you stated, but it's almost just that any card, even if it's not the most powerful iteration of what it is at any given moment, if it fills multiple roles in the game, it'll actually create a more interesting and more complex structure to the game.
Say more about that.
Basically what you're saying is modal spells and scalable threats are good, because even if they are a worse counterspell or a worse card draw spell, the fact that you have the option to do both means you have more consistency in your games. And you're talking about having good decks, not good cards. You're also talking about having better gameplay, the way those decks interact, right?
Yes. And really what that comes down to is that when you think about your cube not as here's all the good cards, pick a CMC and a color and we'll just put the good cards in that slot, and then naturally decks will come out of that. But you instead say, this is the plan I want, right? This is what I want a control deck to be like. I want it to have very cheap card selection and cantrips. I want it to have removal. I want it to have, hard to interact with, win conditions and threats. When you look at it that way, you can start thinking about your cube in terms of just like trying to get as many of these effects in there as possible. If I want there to be a lot of counter magic and card draw and removal, how do I get more of those effects in the environment? And sometimes the answer is you have a card that does both, right? And even though Supreme Will is not very effectively costed at any point, right? Like, I'm not happy to pay 3 mana for that effect in isolation ever for either side of that card. It does fit in really nicely because of the fact that it does both, and it allows you to run both an extra counter spell in your deck and an extra card selection spell. And depending on the context of the game and the matchup and everything, you can have access to both, and that is worth paying the tax in a lot of situations.
So, synergy and modality both fit into this umbrella of the fact that you want decks to be better than just a pile of good cards.
Yeah. The other kind of side of that modality is a card that has, every time I play it, I am convinced it's better and better and better. That's Stonecoil Serpent, which I kind of begrudgingly put in my cube when it came out. I was like, this is probably fine, but I'm not sure it's going to last. It's basically like an upgraded Endless One, which I don't cube and I'm not particularly excited about. But that card has just proven to be such a house in basically any deck that can play it, which is every deck. And the reason is because, if you're playing an aggro deck, it's not about having the best creatures, right? Like, your goal of your aggro deck is not like play the highest quality creatures, because very often the highest quality creatures will be 3-drops and 4-drops or whatever. Like, and it's not about just making sure that all your individual threats are high quality.
I'm gonna say aggro decks, 8 mana, like a Gristlebrand is a pretty high quality creature.
Right, exactly. So your strategy is not play really high quality creatures. Your strategy is curve out. Spend all of your mana on threats that are going to pressure your opponents as much as possible and as quickly as possible. And the reason Stonecoil Serpent is so great for any kind of aggro deck, and when I say aggro, I also mean you can be a mid-range deck up against a control deck. You're now the aggressor, or you can be in an aggro mirror and trying to basically decide if you're going to be proactive or a little more defensive. The fact that it allows basically any hand to curve out, right? Like, if you take random 6 cards from an aggro deck and stick a Stonecoil Serpent into it, the chances that hand can now play a threat in every single turn of the game and use all of its mana are dramatically increased. And that's your strategy. If you're an aggro deck, that's what you're trying to do to win the game. If you go turn 2 or turn 3 without doing anything, without spending your mana to pressure your opponent, then you're going to start to lose. And even if that means you play a 2-mana 2/2, which is a lot worse than a lot of other things at 2 mana in your cube, you don't always have the luxury of drawing your hand in the perfect order and having your ideal opening 7. And these cards, these modal cards, can fill in those gaps and basically allow you to execute your strategy more consistently, even if it's at a less efficient price point. That's true of Supreme Will, it's true of Stonecoil Serpent, it's true of a whole slew of modal cards that I include in my cube. Shark Typhoon is another great example of a card that at any given price point, like, am I really happy to have a cycling, 6 mana 4/4? Like, sure, I guess, but I'd much rather have something else if I knew I had 6 mana, but you don't. When you have Shark Typhoon in your hand, you can spend as much mana as you need to at any point in the game that it's advantageous to you. And so there's a lot of different parts of this point, and this could be also probably a whole show in and of itself, but that's a kind of a big umbrella level up for me, is thinking about choosing my cards so they contribute to the strategies of powerful decks, as opposed to thinking about just choosing the most powerful cards and putting them in my environment.
I love it. That makes sense.
All right, Anthony, your third level up. We are at the midway point.
So since we're talking about synergies, and again, synergy in this broad thing where it doesn't have to say this card names card B, but just the cards work better when they're in a deck together, I really found that it's super important for a lot of these synergistic cards to overlap and not just fit into exactly one particular deck. And the reason for that is we could think of these two, ridiculous reductive extremes. On one end, the cards are just sort of good stuff cards. They do exactly what they say. They function in a vacuum. They don't need other cards to support them. And in that case, when you're drafting, you're not really making decisions as the draft goes and you're choosing cards. You're just taking the best card out of every pack. On the other extreme, if all of the cards work with all the other cards, and every deck kind of wants them equally, we're almost in the same position. So the other way I kind of want to think about this is that it's important that some cards are bad in some contexts, and that you have this right amount of cards are better with other cards, but they're not just better with every other card, so you have this flexibility and this interesting tension as you're drafting your deck.
I love that way of putting it, is including cards consciously that are bad in certain contexts, which sounds like a thing you would want to avoid at all costs, but
right.
That's actually a way I definitely think about my cube. I think about it as I have a certain amount of like cute equity. It's like a term that I use where I want to make sure that my drafters are never stuck with a deck where they're really scraping for playables, where they have all of these cards, maybe in their colors even, that just don't work together because of these conflicting synergies and overlaps that just don't work together. But some of the cards that I'm really excited to include do play in that space. There's really, high variance cards that have a really high ceiling, but the floor is awful, right? They just don't do anything in certain contexts. And I think about that as an amount of space that I have. I have some equity I can spend on those kinds of cards. And as long as I ration that equity correctly, then those cards are really fun build arounds that you get sometimes, you don't get other times. But when you don't get them, it's just one card or two cards in your sideboard that are unplayable, not, a deck that ends up not coming together because of so many of these cards being present. Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And I hadn't really thought of it in those terms before, but I do like the idea of including cards that are, if not intentionally, at least, cards you're totally fine being bad in certain contexts. I will push back a little bit just because you say this a lot on the show, and I know you and I agree on this, but I think it's worth saying, you say that if all the cards are good and don't rely on other cards to be good, then you can just take the best card out of every pack. I do, like, when you say best card out of every pack, you mean, like, best card for the deck you're drafting, which is still, there are still a bunch of orbiting considerations, like curve and densities of threats versus densities of interaction and just the colors, period. Unless you really do have an environment where there's so much fixing you don't have to worry about colors, there are still considerations that go into what makes the best card in a pack. And two, skilled players could disagree on that, in some circumstances.
No, you're totally right. I'm talking about an extremely reductive extreme, like almost to the point where we're saying the fundamental rules of Magic. Like there's some degree of synergy that we're talking about that is baked into the game, like the fact that
it's unavoidable.
A cheap card and an expensive card have a kind of synergy because when you put them into a deck together, you can cast spells at different points in the game. Like, I'm obviously being hyperbolic.
Right. As long as we have clarified that that's what you mean, but in that context, then yes, I agree. Certainly, like, given that so much of that synergy and those relationships are baked in, as you put it, and I agree completely. What do you actually mean then by making sure they overlap and considering them carefully? If it happens so naturally, like what is it you actually have to think about as a designer to make sure those things work together?
So the productive tension is that you don't just look at a card and say, oh yeah, this is, in a very explicit example, like this is just a card for the life gain deck and it only goes in the life gain deck. That's not great because you're only taking it in one context and you're sort of in this sort of like on rails draft. And the other extreme is saying, well, I'm just going to take all the blue cards. All the blue cards are good, and I'll just put them all into it. Like the best ones I end up drafting, curve considerations into account and all that, put them into a pile, and I'll have a functional deck. You want something in between where you're saying, well, this card can fit in a few places. It doesn't always just play out the same way. It does a couple different things, but I don't know exactly what it's going to do here.
I think there's a curve to that attribute of a card, right? Like I have some cards in my cube. Lightning Bolt is a dumb example, but like, what red deck will not run Lightning Bolt? Like, it's hard for me to imagine me drafting a red deck where I'm like, do I really want Lightning Bolt for this deck? Like, I always want Lightning Bolt, right?
Oh, totally. I mean, it doesn't mean that every single card has to be this. I'm just thinking about if we graphed all of these cards in terms of, like, flexibility, what's even the other axis? Maybe it's just looking at a bell curve. Like,
right.
We want the bulk of the cards to fit into this reasonable space that has this tension. Of course, there are going to be some cards that are much more flexible and some that are much more narrow. But even that, like, that provides texture.
Yes. That texture, I think, is important to me. Another example I can think of this is, I've seen some environments that when you think about green ramp, the way they choose to support green ramp is just running all of the one mana dorks, like every printed one. And because if they're aiming for a certain type of ramp deck that, relies on creatures and is trying to be very fast, then those are some of the best ramp things you can have. In my environment, I really like including other kinds of ramp that are sort of complementary so that when you are choosing cards for your deck, you can choose a Wild Growth or what's the other Wild Growth? Utopia Sprawl, or a creature, or a mana rock, or maybe you choose a 2-mana creature that fixes for 5 colors instead of just a 1-mana ramp, because you have reasonable reasons to actually think about taking one or more one of those cards over another one, right? Like if you're up against a deck that has lots of cheap removal that can afford to kill your mana dorks, you're going to want to have some density of non-creature ramp. And if you're up against a deck that is trying to go bigger than you, then you want to have a density of cheap ramps so you can get ahead of them and start to abuse tempo. And just giving, even within a certain type of effect, providing enough variation on it that your drafters have decisions to make about the synergies and the interactions between those cards and other cards that could be considered to occupy the same slot.
Totally. And I think overall, this kind of concept of overlapping synergies does apply pretty differently at these different power levels. So if you're in a power optimized environment where you're trying to play all the best cards from the history of Magic, I think you're going to have this kind of overlap. I think you can't really avoid it. So I think it's almost more of a concern or something you need to think about in a explicit way when you're talking about a lower powered environment where you do have these kind of explicit synergies, like I have potentially a life gain deck, and you don't want these cards that just fit exactly into the one spot.
So how would you sum that up then? What was your what was your title for that level up?
Overlapping synergies are good,
but not too overlapping.
Right. I mean, it's sort of an abstract thought that, you know, the more that I've pushed more overlapping synergies, it also just means that you get more different options for different deck builds, which is really valuable.
My third one is pretty straightforward, and it is loosening up aesthetic balance.
Oh, nice.
Here I'm talking about having the same number of cards in each color, having the same number of cards in each guild, even having the same number of like fixing lands of each color pair, or having symmetrical cycles is another good example of this kind of aesthetic balance. There are a lot of things that as a cube designer, looking at your cube on Cube Cobra, you know, day in, day out, you kind of start to think of it in this abstract way where it's this beautiful, pristine spreadsheet of all these beautiful cards. And a lot of times people are motivated to try and balance everything, right? Like have exactly 50 cards or whatever in each color and make sure that every color pair gets their 2 cards and their 2 fixing lands or whatever. And my cube initially was perfectly balanced. And over time, I started to get a little more kind of haphazard with it. And then at some point, anything that you can see from the sort of 10,000 foot view of looking at the cube on Cube Cobra, like it is so incredibly abstracted and muddied and removed from the actual draft experience. And you can have a cube.
Yeah, I mean, even calling that experience or that structure of a cube that has equal numbers of cards in every color, equal number of lands, equal number of gold cards in every pair, to say like that is what makes a balanced cube, I think is almost just a misleading way to phrase that. Because it doesn't get
right.
it. Like,
that's why I said aesthetic
gameplay
balance.
is at all.
Because what is balance, right? There's a lot of ways you can take that word, but there's so many ways that whole idea doesn't even make sense, right? You were talking about overlapping synergies. There are some monocolored cards that you are just very unlikely to play with another color. And a good example is like if you have a white board wipe, how many green-white decks are going to be happy to play that board wipe? And the answer is in most environments, very few, because green tends to be a color that plays to the board, has a lot of creatures in play, and so it's pretty unlikely you're going to be excited to have your board wipe in your green-white deck. So is that Wrath of God just a white card, or is it actually a like hybrid white-blue, white-red, white-black card that can go in these certain color combinations? And that's true for every card in the environment. There's always overlapping synergy. So even if you do have a perfectly quote-unquote aesthetically balanced cube, it's not actually, because when the cards actually end up getting drafted and make their way into people's hands, they're not perceiving that. And more importantly, you can have things be dramatically aesthetically out of balance and just no one will ever notice. There's a lot of leeway and flexibility there that I think a lot of cube designers maybe don't take appropriate advantage of. So now, you know, my cube is pretty wonky. I even have, you know, one of the ones that I think is most jarring to people is I even have unbalanced fixing lands. You know, I have the 6 Horizon lands, which, first of all, the fact that there are 6 is weird, and I don't have them in the other 4 colors because they've never been printed. And you could think of those lands as like an additional dual for that color pair, but actually those are kind of hybrid lands in the way that, you know, hybrid cards are hybrid cards, because you'll play you'll play the blue-red Horizon land, which I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head. You'll play that.
Fiery Islet.
There you go. Yeah, you'll play Fiery Islet in your blue-black deck because you want a way to get rid of your lands late game. So I have those. I have, you know, 3 of the 5 triomes. You know, I just kind of play whatever I think is right. And it never has anyone ever commented in the draft like, well, gosh, seems like there's not enough white cards. There's not enough, you know, these cards. So I also said loosening because I don't think this should be totally ignored. The Degenerate Microcube has wildly out of balance colors. I think there's like 6 green cards in the entire cube, if you exclude cards that are just meant to be cheated into play, like 5 or 6 green cards, and there's like 30 blue cards and 30 black cards. So it's wildly out of balance there. And it does have an impact on the environment, right? Like you can tell when you're drafting that cube that, gosh, there really aren't that many green cards. And if you're playing green, you're basically Oath of Druids or Channel or nothing. There's no green deck that is not doing one of those two things pretty much. So there is an impact on the environment. I say loosening because I don't actually know, I'm not sure where the line is for my primary cube, which has all 5 colors represented, doesn't have any kind of novelties or gimmicks like the Degenerate Micro Cube does. I don't know at what point I would be dissatisfied to have things be too out of balance, but my current attitude is just when I go to make cuts for a new set, I just cut any card that I think is underperforming or, not meeting my design goals and to put in the new card. I don't care about lighting up colors or CMCs or anything. I'm just always cutting whatever I don't like and putting in stuff I do.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's more important to pay attention to how the environment actually plays than what it looks like on a spreadsheet, because is it stupid to compare this to like graphic design where we say, well, we can center this object in a page, but then it kind of looks off-center because that's not really how we perceive things. It's more important to center it based on how you actually perceive it. And the same thing is true. Like, you want to actually balance things based on the way that they're playing, not just the way it looks on the spreadsheet.
I think you're right. The only reason I'd be hesitant to like endorse that fully is I think it might encourage some people to say like, all right, well, let's go through and look at every card and see how it's perceived. Like, let's say that Wrath of God is actually just a blue-white card pretty much, and maybe categorize it that way. And Magic is too complicated to actually
right. When I say perceived, I mean not like trying to come up with a more rigorous metric for categorizing things. I mean just thinking about like, well, does this color feel open more often than it should in the draft?
Right.
And yeah, thinking about the way that the environment actually plays and the way the draft feels.
Yeah, I mean, you could have a color that has 10% less cards than every other color, but if it has a much higher density of cards people are excited to take early in packs, then guess what color is going to be split the most between your drafters and most of your drafts? It's the one with all the cards people want to draft.
Yeah,
It doesn't matter how many cards there actually are. Anthony's perennial issue with blue in his cube, maybe not even issue, but you've noted before that you feel like blue gets oversplit in your cube before. Blue
gets very split, and I think that's not a problem necessarily. Like, blue is the best supporting color. So yeah, the fact that it gets split often, and you'll be like, well, yeah, I'm base green, I'm base white, but like, we're taking different kinds of blue cards for different reasons. That kind of plays out pretty well, I think.
Yeah, it's a great support color, so I don't think it's necessarily a problem. And I remember you saying this to me, and I kind of sat down and looked at your cube and was like, do I think there are more appealing blue cards than there are other colors? And I didn't think so. Like, looking at the cube list, I was like, no, I feel like I would take, it's not like I'm being more drawn to the blue cards than other cards, but that's what we mean by how the environment actually plays, right? Don't try and come up with this next level thought technology where you like uber categorize all of your cards in all these complicated ways, because it's really not possible. Just loosen it up, let yourself do whatever you want. And the only exception I'll give to this, right, is that obviously I think some people really like the harsh restrictions and find creativity in that. They like forcing themselves to find their, 50th red card because they want to have exactly 50, and like really having to cut down their blue section because there's so many good blue cards everyone loves. How are you going to run just 50 of them? They like that sort of exercise. And if that is good for you, great. I would just say be very conscious of the fact that if you are beholden to some removed value set, like this idea of aesthetics, as we've established, is like an arbitrary value, right? It's arbitrary that you have exactly 50 because that's not how it's going to feel. So it's kind of a made up rule you made up for yourself. If you're beholden to that made up rule, you're probably sacrificing something else somewhere, right? There's probably a little more variance in power than you want, or there's probably a little fewer of a certain effect than you would otherwise have because you are sacrificing it to uphold this aesthetic value.
I mean, I would just phrase it differently. I wouldn't say you should be less beholden to this balance and symmetry, but that you can be. If you're not getting joy from the spreadsheet aesthetics, it's okay to loosen up.
Yeah. I'm gonna go further. I'm gonna say you should be.
Okay.
I don't like to be dogmatic on this show, but I really think that nothing about that spreadsheet really matters when you're actually playing the cube. And I guess if you're designing a cube just to be looked at, sure. But for like 99% of people, I think they put too much importance on this. I think people should just loosen up, cut cards you don't like or that are always riding sideboards or that don't fit your game plan. Put in more cards that do, even if they're in colors that already have a little bit of overrepresentation. I think you'll be happy if you do that.
I'll take you one step further and say I don't even think the number of cards in your cube matters all that much. It's nice to say here's my 360 card. I wondered if you were going to point this out. Here's my 360 card cube. It's exactly what we need for a full draft pod. But it's so nice just to have like I ended up doing this honestly because I started designing my cube. I thought about bumping it up to 16 card packs because 384 is such a more beautiful number, honestly. And then I was like, well, why am I even doing this? Let's just keep adding cards. It's hard to make cuts. And it's just such a more freeing experience to say, like, well, this card isn't really working anymore, or it's overpowered. I can just cut it without having to look for a replacement. And vice versa, if I just want to add a card because I'm curious to try it. Just having this totally flexible number of cards that's hovering between, let's say, 360 and 450 is kind of my range, is really a great and satisfying way to build a cube.
Yeah, I wonder if you're going to call me out on this, because that is, of course,
I don't mean to call you out.
No, do it. That's what makes good radio.
Now that you've mentioned it...
Because, yeah, that is the biggest way that, like, obviously no one can tell how big the cube is when you sit down to draft it. Like, no one knows how many cards are left in the box. It's completely irrelevant. The reason I do stick to 360 is partially like a self-discipline thing. Like, I would have a hard time not just continuing to grow the cube and, like, having some criteria for which cards get cut at that point. Like, and it also, I do think it is a bit of a cop-out in that it makes some things easier, right? Like,
that's not a cop-out, that's an improvement.
No, I'm saying it's a cop-out for me. It's a cop-out for me to keep it at exactly 360 because it makes it easier for me to guarantee things are supported because I know the entire cube is going to be seen. And I don't really have
there is an actual
combos.
Practical change in the gameplay in that in a 360 card cube drafted between 8 players, you do see every single card, so you can support like 2 card combos and interactions more easily. So I think that the fact that I'm designing a cube this way also fits with just the kind of gameplay and the kinds of cards and interactions that I'm interested in.
Right, and I don't even have that kind of stuff really in my primary cube. I don't have combos, you know.
Then you're just wrong.
Well, I mean, you could argue that, but I do think that knowing that all the cards are in the draft just gives you a little more control over exactly what is supported and how. Like, for example, aggro is a really good example. I think if I were to go to 400 or to 420 or something nice, and was trying to still support aggro is the kind of archetype that you really can't afford to run an off-plan card or 2 or 3. You can't just have cards that don't really fit your strategy because you need a density of the certain types of cards you're going to get. And as the size goes up, somewhat counterintuitively, if you're going to only play with a subset of the cube, you actually have to run more than the sort of same ratio of aggro cards. Again, these are really just oversimplifying here because there's lots of cards that go in aggro and other kinds of strategies, but if you have let's say 10% of your cube is aggro only cards at 360. If you go to 420, I think you need more than 10% of the cube to be those cards to ensure that most draft people can still make this thing happen. Because as soon as you introduce the extra variance of some of these cards won't be in the draft, then if you imagine that sort of graph of the cube and here's a sliver of it that is here to support aggro, now there's an uncertainty on that sliver, right? Now there's like a fuzzy edge.
You're adding some variance, but you'll also have drafts where you'll end up having the much better aggro deck because they're end up being more opened. So I don't think that's that important, but I think the other thing that is like very much related to what you're saying is that you do need to think about things in terms of percentages or like in R&D terms as fans, not in terms of just absolute numbers. So as soon as you're making a cube that you're drafting a subset from, you can't fit in more different archetypes and more different strategies because you still need to think in terms of percentages. And that's also related to the challenge of if you're sticking to singleton, you're also going to be lowering the power level in a power optimized environment on average.
Right.
So this is complicated.
Yeah.
Let's do an episode on this.
There's no reason this is a good episode for us to just kind of like farm out episode ideas. So maybe people can comment or
thanks for participating in our let's talk about what we're going to talk about next time episode.
I do think that, there are certain archetypes that do need to be supported in that way. Like, I wouldn't think, oh boy, I'm going up to 420, I really have to add in more control cards, right? Because the way that control works is it can play a lot of different kinds of things as long as it has a few key pieces. And so all you do is make sure you have a density of those key pieces. It takes up very few slots, whereas aggro has a much more... Again, these are...
you can guarantee a consistency that if in the 360 card cube, if you sit down, you first pick Sulfuric Vortex, and you find that you're the only person drafting that aggro deck, you will get all the pieces you want. I think that the actual answer to this, for me, is not, over-support those. It's just, we should draft more so that you can enjoy that variance.
I don't know.
Play more
Anyway,
cube.
Look, that's my reason for sticking with it, is I feel
like... No, it makes sense. It makes sense.
And I'll say this. I've said before, and I still kind of feel this way, if I ever felt like my cube got to a point where I was just totally happy with it, like there's no cards here that I feel like are underperforming or sort of languishing in sideboards or out of place or don't really have a home, then I might consider at that point being like, I'm really happy with this. Now I'm just going to start making it a little bit bigger. Like I've reached a point where like I've crossed some threshold. Now I'm just going to grow the cube over time and maybe cut a card every now and then when there's a new card that comes out that I can kind of swap out. But I don't think I'm ever going to get there. I think that's like this ideal that we're always shooting for, but can never really reach. I don't expect to get to a point where I feel like my cube is that balanced. And so instead, I just have this in-out thing where I put cards that I think are exciting and think might help the decks I want to be successful in the cube, and I cut cards that are underperforming and kind of keep it going that way. I like the control I have at 360 of guaranteeing, that a certain cards will be open in a certain percentage without this uncertainty that comes from having a bigger cube you play a portion of. But I appreciate you pushing back on that, though, because that is a little bit of hypocrisy.
Next level up, never expect to be happy.
Never expect happiness. This is America in 2021. You thought you'd be happy. Oh, you sweet summer child. All right, Anthony, what's your fourth and final personal cube level up?
All right, I want to talk about something a little bit more specific, and maybe you can help me tease out like the core issue here.
I love to tease.
Maybe we can troll out the core issue here. So I initially, when I designed my cube, for a lot of factors, I had a bunch of tap lands. I wanted lands to be sort of a core theme, and it still is. Even though it isn't, you're not going to see it draft a lot of decks that are like, this is the lands deck, absolutely, but it touches a little bit of everything. And one of the things I had was, I think I had 8 or 10 Evolving Wilds, which interact with a couple landfall cards, and also there's a fair amount of like top deck manipulation. And what we learned very quickly was that these actually didn't play into that theme at all, because there was such a huge cost to not cracking your Evolving Wilds as soon as it had the least impact on your mana. So you kind of had to like turn 1 or maybe turn 3 along with a 2-drop, crack your Evolving Wild so it wouldn't disrupt your game plan. And that meant that you actually couldn't do any of those synergies at all, because you couldn't just say, well, I'm just going to sit on this Evolving Wilds until I get my, Bolas' Citadel or my Tireless Tracker in play. So I swapped them for Prismatic Vistas, and that problem was kind of solved, because you absolutely can do that. Still, if you want to be able to cast your 3-drop on turn 3 and you need the right mana, you'll still play it. But you're not punished for just saying, well, I'll just hold on to this and potentially get that little bit of upside later on if I can. So, like, how do we abstract that and say, like, I guess that's really just what we talk about so much.
Choose good cards
is like
for your cube, listener. My
well,
level
but
up is doing
the
a
level up
good cube
is
design.
not that Evolving Wilds is less powerful, which it is objectively less powerful than Prismatic Vista, but it's that it actually forced kinds of gameplay decisions that weren't leading into the kinds of gameplay that I was hoping for.
Yeah, you're talking about thinking about your cube from the perspective of a designer and not the perspective of a player. As a player, you're just trying to optimize your win percentage, and that means, doing whatever is optimal in terms of picks and gameplay decisions. And if you're only thinking about Magic in that lens, then, you might decide Evolving Wilds is the power level I want. I don't want more powerful lands, and then you would miss this whole layer of actually the kinds of decisions I want people making are enabled by this other land, regardless of its objective power level in a vacuum.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. It's like it's the shift that I had in just thinking about power level of cards and trying to keep that even and balanced, even though I was already sort of exploring this lower power level environment. Power level is still a thing that you have to think about, but shifting from just thinking about that to thinking about the kinds of gameplay decisions different cards supported was a big shift.
And that, to me, I think that is a level up in the sense that a lot of people that are new to cube design get caught at the stage of, like, make this cube reasonably power level balanced, right? Don't have huge outliers, make sure all the sort of decks are draftable and competitive with each other, and don't have these extremely polarizing matchups. And if you're stuck in that world, it is very hard to think about this layer of what kinds of decisions do you want to enable, because that's a luxury you don't have. You're trying to figure out how to make it so aggro doesn't win every single draft, or this green mid-range deck, it doesn't just get stomped every single time for reasons that are mysterious to you. And I still see experienced cube designers talking about things like, and I know you and I hate this terminology, but like the Golgari problem, like what does a good black-green deck look like in cube? And it's like if you're still stuck on that level of nuts and bolts balance, then you don't get to think about this next level, literally a next level of, all right, now we're beyond what everyone else thinks about with every other Magic format in history, where you only get the luxury of playing, you don't get the luxury of designing. Now we're thinking about is this the kind of thing you want your players to be considering? Do you want them to think about when to crack their fetch land or not? And if you don't, give them the Evolving Wilds because they are motivated by the game to crack that as soon as possible. If you do want them to think about it, then give them the Prismatic Vista and let them choose. I was going to bring this up, Anthony. Paulo Vitor Damarosa has a relatively new YouTube channel as of like 4 weeks ago, putting out a couple videos a week that is excellent. I love it and cannot recommend it highly enough. And one of his videos was just the top 5 mistakes you're making, and it was kind of contextualized specifically to the current standard environment. And one of them was just stop sacrificing your Fabled Passage. like don't sacrifice Fabled Passage until you have a good reason to do so.
The first one of these things is stop sacrificing your Fabled Passage. Right, because Fabled Passage is one of the most played cards in Standard, and sometimes even in other formats. And the biggest mistake that I see people making with it is that they sacrifice it too early. Right now in Standard, there are a lot of decks that have a lot of benefit from having Fabled Passage. For example, Grew Adventures, right? You have Landfall, you have the Elemental, you have the Mammoth. So you have several cards that get better if you can sacrifice a land and put them into play. And a lot of people get too tunneled on the deck thinning aspect of it, right? Because deck thinning, for those who don't know, is a concept that means you remove a bad card from your deck, right? So when you sacrifice Fabled Passage, you remove a land from your deck, assuming you don't want to draw lands. This makes sense, right? Because you're taking away from your deck a card that you don't want to draw. So that is a good thing, and that is why people tend to sacrifice Fabled Passage as early as possible. But the thing is that it is just a very minute thing. The percentage that you get is very, very small. And it's usually not worth it if you have any reason not to do that. So for example, imagine you have nothing in your hand as a Grow Adventures player, and then you sacrifice your Fabled Passage because you want to draw something, right? And you draw Brushfire Elemental. Then you can play, but you can't sacrifice the Fabled Passage because you don't have it anymore. So you just lost out on 2 damage. And that is way, way, way more important than any deck thinning you might have done.
And I had the thought that it reminded me, first of all, of your story we've talked about before about this kind of level up moment from Evolving Wilds to Prismatic Vista. And I wondered even if, I know you already bought the Prismatic Vistas, but if Fabled Passage instead of Prismatic Vista would even encourage players that aren't thinking on this level to actually kind of accidentally discover it because they're waiting to get their 4th land in play, so they're kind of intentionally pushing off the Fabled Passage so it can come in untapped, as opposed to Prismatic Vista, which they might play at their earliest opportunity still because they're not thinking about, what about my Tireless Tracker, what about my sort of top deck manipulation? And Fabled Passage actually, I think, a little bit has this like opposite pull of Evolving Wilds, where it's like, unless you're stuck on lands and you know you have to play this before you get to 4, you really want to wait until the mid to late game to actually play your Fabled Passage. And I wondered if that might even be a slightly better fit for your goals.
So you're right, and I hate that.
Mostly you hate that I'm right, or you hate that you already own 10 Prismatic Vistas, and now maybe Fabled Passage is similar but different?
I'm not making the change. For some reason, aesthetically, I really, really dislike Fabled Passage. It just feels so weird and clunky to me.
Interesting.
The bigger reason, like, I think that you're totally right on the fact that it sort of informs that kind of play a lot better, or sort of like leads you there naturally. Makes a lot of sense. But I think that also another tension in the format is that aggro does need help, and I'm trying to support 2-color aggressive decks, so
sure.
Prismatic Vistas are also a big part of that.
Yeah. Well, we've said more lands was an important thing. So how about you keep the current? And you said you don't run a sort of rigid number of cards in your cube. Keep your cube as is. Just put in 10 Fabled Passages too.
Gross.
It's a lot of lands, baby.
I've been thinking the opposite. I'm probably going to add some of the filter lands in Naya colors.
I think that filter lands are good. They're fast. We like those. How is that the opposite?
I don't know why I hate Fabled Passage so much.
I didn't know you hated it. I mean, I think threshold cards are like kind of 50-50s for me on whether or not I'm going to think they're interesting to play with. Sometimes threshold cards feel very frustrating to me, where it's like, just because of this dumb little fiddly accounting thing, like I don't have the right number of cards in my graveyard or whatever, this card is dramatically morphed. I think Fabled Passage for me is in kind of a sweet spot where it's not a horrible card if you have to play it and have your land come in and play tapped, right? It's an Evolving Wilds, which is fine.
Sure.
And so the difference in, the two sides of that coin is not night and day. It's like day and slightly brighter day. So that one I think actually kind of works for me. I like it from a design perspective, but I can see why the idea of now I have to like have this extra meta level of thinking about my sequencing might be like the kind of decision you don't think is interesting to make. Can I wait till I get to 4 or not? And how does that affect
I think
my
more
my
it
plays?
just rewards and like advertises that it rewards the bigger, greedier decks, and like that feeling of like, oh, I'm playing a pretty focused deck, and then my opponent's like, oh, they have their 4 lands, and now all their Fabled Passages are just free fixing, and they can just go into unleash their greed. It just feels bad.
So is it really just that like the 1 life from Prismatic Vista makes you feel like that holds back that greed?
No, because I think it supports decks of different speeds, whereas I think Fabled Passage just looks so much worse in an aggressive deck.
I would still play it in an aggressive deck for what it's
Sure,
worth,
yeah.
but I'd be less happy about it. All right, so how did we decide to sum that one up?
That was the task I gave you.
I like that we summarize it as thinking about the kinds of decisions that your cards enable you to make, and whether or
Right,
not
yeah.
those are the decisions you want to be fun. This is really like the game designer level of cube design, beyond what are the archetypes you like, and how do you make sure the cube is reasonably balanced and all that kind of stuff. This is like, all right, now, are the decisions your players are making in drafting gameplay fun? Are they interesting?
Right.
Are they overwhelming because they have too many options and they feel like if they don't consider all of them and make the right one, then it's very frustrating? Like, those kinds of things. Is definitely a meta level that I find very rewarding in cube design, and I did not think about initially in my first version of my own cube.
So it's thinking about not just power level, but play patterns, and also how do we make the optimal patterns also the interesting and challenging patterns.
Yeah, maybe you could call this level up something like make the fun thing the right thing to do or something.
Oh
like
yeah,
that.
I wonder if we've talked about that before.
My 4th and final level up, the last level up of the show, and I think this is a nice cap to everything we've talked about, because I think when you get deep in the cube design world and in thinking about things abstractly and theoretically, sometimes it's easy to lose a little bit of reference to the life on the ground, just the day-to-day life of playing your cube. And my last level
So we're
up
talking
is
about the importance of choosing the right basic lands for your cube.
essential, very, very essential. No, my last level up, Anthony, is simply not liking a card is a good enough reason not to play it. And the poster child of this for me is Questing Beast. So what I mean by this is that I think it's very rewarding and very productive to try and explain your cube design philosophy, to give it structure, to actually state your goals, and then measure the cards in your cube against your stated goals and ask yourself, is this card serving my goals or is it not serving my goals, and why? I think that is kind of the exercise of cube design, and I think it's very valuable, and it leads to better environments overall when you do this exercise. But sometimes a card can check all the boxes and line up with every single goal you have for your environment, and you can still just say, fuck it, I don't want to play that card. It's got all these dumb words on it, and I just hate it. And that's Questing Beast for me, Anthony, because I really love supporting like a meaty green mid-range. And so when I start thinking about my green 4 and 5 slot, I want cards that are hard-hitting against control, like really pose a big threat. I want cards that have a good board presence against aggro, so that I can't just be swinging into my opponent's stuff and they don't just die to lightning strikes or shocks or whatever. And I want to get like value off the cards almost immediately. I also have kind of an overarching theme in my cube of I like giving players ways to interact with planeswalkers as directly as possible, which the most basic way is just combat, obviously, but I'll gladly play a card at any time that can put a little additional pressure on planeswalkers and a little extra heat on them. And so when Questing Beast was spoiled, it's like, ding, 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 ding. Right down the board, this is a card that's the right power level for my cube. It's this powerful green 4-drop. It's got haste, so you're going to get in and deal damage to your opponent before they're board wipe or something. And it has this line where it helps you like pick off planeswalkers in the process of also killing your opponent. You don't have to actually divert resources to the planeswalker. You can just kill them like you would normally. And now because of its extra text, that planeswalker dies anyway. Checks all the boxes. But I hate that card. I think it's stupid. I hate all the text on it. I hate the word salad effects. And it was in my cube because I felt like I was somehow obligated to run it because it lined up with all of my cube design goals. And then I just cut it when I made my changes for, I think it was, what was the first set this year? Ikoria. For Ikoria, I think I cut it at that point. I was like, you know what? There are enough good green 4s that meet my goals. I don't have to play this one that checks all of the proverbial boxes. And it's very liberating. So I don't think this tip applies to everybody. You, for example, I probably think this is an insane thing to be a level up moment. Like, why would I ever play a card I didn't like in the first place?
I think it's crazy because Questing Beast is my favorite Magic card, and I love it.
Oh, shut up. You hate it, too.
It's true.
So I think for some people, they're like, obviously, why would this ever be in consideration? But for some other people, especially if you're like me and you really love this abstract layer of theory and giving structure to your decisions and stating your goals and sort of making sure that everything lines up to them, here's your free pass, listener. If you don't like a card, just don't play it. You can find other cards that sort of serve those goals. You don't have to run the cards that really drive you nuts.
Easy.
I guess you probably never had a card you cut for not liking. You probably just never put it in.
Yeah, I've had to unfortunately do a lot more of the opposite of cutting
cards you
cards
like
that I
because
really
they don't
like,
actually align
but
with your goals.
Yeah, did not support a good, healthy gameplay.
That's a good corollary that maybe applies to more listeners. If you have cards you really like, ask yourself, do these actually align with my cube goals? Do they lead to the kinds of decisions I want? Do they support the decks I want to be viable? Or do I just like this card because I like it and it doesn't actually line up with any of my goals?
But here's the sort of meta thought that we touched on a little bit, is that we don't have to follow any of these rules rigidly, which is, exactly what you're saying here. And there are still a couple of cards that are like kind of huge power outliers in my cube, but because it is a pretty small subset, it's fairly forgiving, and the environment can tolerate that without just feeling like, yep, here's this card again, the game is over. And I think that now that I've sort of gotten it down to a reasonable balance, if I really wanted to bring, I don't know, Tatiova back, I could, and I'd probably end up cutting one of these other sort of outliers and keep things mostly in that bell curve where things work pretty well.
That's kind of like you're saying you have some power outlier equity in the same way that I said I had some cutesy equity before. You've got a certain amount of space where you're like, this can be cards that are on a different axis than other cards in my environment, and it won't warp things so much because they're kept to a sort of nice balance. They're sprinkled in. They're not ever present.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Let's call it there. This has been a nice meaty episode. I think people are going to like this one. This is your last week to fill out the Call Time Cube survey. Do not miss your chance to have your voice heard. It only takes a few minutes. Anthony spent a lot of time making that survey look real nice. You can view the cards by images. You can view them by a list. You can, give us your comments, drag these little sliders, survey all the cards. And we turn that into a nice article that captures the spirit of the community's opinions about cards at the set's release, which I think is valuable for all kinds of reasons. So go to luckypaper.co/survey/KHM and give us your opinions. And I'm serious. No one has ever taken us up on, that's not entirely true. For the most part, people haven't taken us up on sending voice memos. But if you have anything you want to say about any of these cards from Call Time or the mechanics or anything, record a little voice memo on your phone, send it to that same email address, and I will perhaps pepper it into our episode next week with Jet. I'm excited to talk about Call Time next week, Anthony.
If nothing else, just record a voice memo just saying Usher of the Fallen.
Yeah, if everybody send us a voice memo of why you have a crush on Usher of the Fallen.
Just
and
the
we'll
name.
compose a little
Just
love
the
letter.
name.
Yeah, the Usher of the Fallen supercut will be at the end of the episode. That's it for Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the Magic cards are made by Wizards of the Coast. Thank you, all of our listeners out there, for listening and filling out our survey. And thank you, Anthony, for talking about Magic with me.
Thanks for talking about Magic with me. I have a question, though. Are you testing Usher of the Fallen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
I am.
Okay.
And I'm in the Usher of the Fallen Crush Squad.
Feels like it's 2000... Jesus. I can't do years.
Feel like it's 2000 Jesus?
But what? Never mind.
Was this a teen girl squad? Or
I was trying to make an Usher reference. I don't remember.
Oh, Usher the musician. I see. Oh, that'll be a good intro for next week's show.
Oh, hell yeah.
Usher. There is always that one drop that will always have my heart. Never seen it coming because it was boasting from the start. I'll work on that.
That's
I'll get working on
perfect. That's perfect.
All right.
And if this doesn't
Awesome,
get
Sammy.
edited, it'll lead seamlessly into the next episode.
There we go. It'll be a little Easter egg.